Diocletian had an army, a treasury, and absolute power. He also had a grocery bill that was getting out of hand. So in the year 301, he did what every confident ruler since has done. He fixed the prices. He issued an edict, the Edictum de Pretis Rerum Venalium, listing the maximum price for over 1,000 goods: bread, meat, wine, wool. He called it stabilization. He backed it with the threat of death for anyone who charged more. And within months, the shelves were empty, not because Rome ran out of food. Because the farmers and the merchants looked at his fixed prices, did the math, and decided it wasn't worth selling. They hid their goods. They stopped producing. They moved to the black market. The price controls didn't lower prices. They erased the market entirely, and with it, the only signal that told anyone where to send food, how much to produce, or what anything was actually worth. Diocletian had tried to replace the market with his own judgment. And it turned out his judgment, the judgment of the most powerful man in the Western world, was not nearly enough. That was 1700 years ago. And here's the thing that should stop you cold. It happened again, and again, and again. Not as a metaphor, not as a loose historical rhyme. The same error, the same mechanism, the same collapse. In Imperial China, in revolutionary France, in the Soviet Union, in 1970s America, in 21st century Venezuela. Different languages, different ideologies, different centuries, one blueprint. By the end of this video, you're going to know the name of that blueprint. You're going to understand the 3 words at the center of every one of these failures. And you're going to be able to look at any new policy, any one, and know before the results come in whether it carries the same fatal flaw. Here's the question nobody in your nightly news cycle is asking. If this pattern is this old, this consistent, this documented, why does it keep working? Why do confident, educated, well-intentioned people keep walking into the same wall? That answer is what this video is actually about. There was a man who spent his entire career trying to answer that question. His name was Friedrich Hayek, and the answer he arrived at was so simple and so devastating that the economics profession spent 30 years pretending he hadn't said it. In 1945, Hayek published a paper in the American Economic Review called The Use of Knowledge in Society. It's 4,000 words. It might be the most important 4,000 words written in the 20th century. His argument goes like this. Every economy, every market, every city, every neighborhood runs on information, not the kind of information you can put in a spreadsheet. The kind that lives in 10 million separate minds at once. The farmer who knows his soil is going dry this season. The trucker who knows the highway to Memphis is backed up until Thursday. The baker who knows her customers have started buying less bread since the price went up. No one person knows all of this. No committee can gather it. No algorithm can replicate it. It is by its very nature dispersed, scattered across millions of people who each hold a tiny, irreplaceable piece of the whole. And here is the genius of what a market actually does. It compresses all of that invisible, dispersed knowledge into a single number, a price. When bread costs more, it's not arbitrary. That number is a signal, compressed information from farmers, truckers, bakers, and buyers, all the way down the chain, encoded into something you can read at the register. Change the price by decree. And you don't stabilize anything. You jam the signal. You cut the wire. You send everyone in the economy driving blind, without the only map they had. Hayek called this the knowledge problem. And his point wasn't that planners are stupid. His point was that the task itself is impossible. No human mind, no matter how brilliant, no matter how credentialed, can possess the information that the market processes automatically every hour of every day across billions of simultaneous transactions. This is not a political opinion. It is a structural fact about the nature of knowledge, and it is the foundation of everything that follows. But he didn't stop there. 43 years later, in 1988, Hayek was 89 years old, writing what would be his final book. He put a name on the error itself, not just the mechanism, the belief that generates it. He called it the fatal conceit. The fatal conceit is the assumption that a human mind or a group of human minds can survey a complex society and deliberately redesign it to produce better outcomes than those that emerge from the accumulated habits, rules, prices, and practices that millions of people have developed over centuries of trial and error. It is the belief that you know better, not just a little better, better enough to override the system entirely, to set the price, fix the wage, allocate the resource, plan the production, and produce a superior result. That belief, Hayek argued, is not merely wrong. It is the most dangerous idea in the history of human civilization, and he spent his life proving it. Let's run the proof. Diocletian, 301 AD, you already know how that ended. Maximum prices, disappearing goods, a black market that the edict was designed to eliminate. Historians note that the edict was quietly abandoned within a few years because enforcing it had become impossible. The information the market had encoded in its prices wasn't replaced by Diocletian's numbers. It simply vanished. And Rome was poorer for it. Same mechanism. Different century. Stalin, 1929. The Soviet Union collectivized its agriculture. Private farms were abolished. The state took ownership of the land and directed production from Moscow. The planners had data. They had goals. They had the apparatus of an entire government. What they didn't have was the knowledge held by 20 million individual farmers. Knowledge about this field, this soil, this season, this community, that had taken generations to accumulate and couldn't be written in a report and sent to a ministry. The result, between 1932 and 1933, the Ukraine, one of the most fertile agricultural regions on Earth, experienced a famine. Historians, working from Soviet archives opened after 1991, document that somewhere between 5 and 7 million people died, not from drought, not from blight, from the destruction of the information system that had told farmers what to grow, how much, and when. The planners replaced that system with their own judgment. Their judgment was catastrophically insufficient for the task. The same error, the same mechanism, 43 years later, and 5,000 miles away from Diocletian's Rome. Now come closer to home. August 1971. Richard Nixon, a Republican, this is worth noting because the fatal conceit does not belong to one party, imposed a 90-day freeze on wages and prices across the entire American economy. Phase 2 followed. Then Phase 3. The administration genuinely believed it could manage the information encoded in tens of millions of American prices better than the market could. If you were alive in the early 1970s, you remember what came next. Gas lines stretching around the block. Shortages of goods that had been readily available the week before. Farmers who stopped bringing livestock to market because the price controls made it unprofitable. The administration kept adjusting the controls, kept adding exceptions, kept trying to fine-tune a system too complex to be fine-tuned. By 1974, the controls were dismantled. The damage, the disruption to production, the distorted signals, the misallocated resources contributed to the stagflation that defined the decade. Not a theory, not a metaphor, a documented American outcome within the living memory of this audience. The pattern now has 3 data points across 1,700 years, but you might still be wondering, fine, these are old examples, distant examples. What about now? Turn on the news from Venezuela in 2017. Hugo Chávez's government had spent years imposing price controls on food and medicine. His successor, Nicolas Maduro, deepened them. The logic was compassionate, at least in its stated form. Food is a human right. Therefore, food prices must be affordable. But the mechanism doesn't care about the stated intention. When prices are set below the market level, producers stop producing. When producers stop producing, shelves go empty. When shelves go empty and governments print money to cover the deficit, the currency collapses. The International Monetary Fund documented inflation in Venezuela reaching over 1 million % in 2018. Not 10%, not 100%, 1 million %. A country with the largest proven oil reserves on Earth could not stock its grocery stores. Children were going hungry in a nation built on petroleum wealth. The planners had the oil. They had the power. They had the genuine belief that they could manage the economy more justly than the market could. What they didn't have was the knowledge. And you cannot substitute intention for information. Now here's the part that hits closer to home. From January 2020 to its peak in mid-2022, the Federal Reserve expanded its balance sheet from roughly $4.2 trillion to nearly $9 trillion. That is money created, in an economic sense, by institutional decision, by a committee in Washington that believed it understood the consequences well enough to manage them. In June of 2022, the Bureau of Labor Statistics reported that consumer prices had risen 9.1% in a single year, the highest inflation rate in 40 years. groceries, gas, rent, the things you buy every week. The purchasing power that you built over decades of work, not spent irresponsibly, not gambled away, simply reduced by the decisions of people who believed they knew better than the accumulated information encoded in the price system. That's not a political critique. It's an observation about the mechanism. The knowledge problem doesn't ask who's in charge. It applies to anyone who tries to substitute their own certainty for the dispersed information of a complex economy. And it always produces the same result. You weren't imagining it. The map was erased. Again, here's the part nobody told you. In 1943, in the middle of a war in Oxford, England, a man named C.S. Lewis published a short book called The Abolition of Man. Lewis was not an economist. He was a literary scholar, a Christian apologist, the author of books for children about a wardrobe and a lion. He had no formal training in economics or political philosophy. But in The Abolition of Man, he described something that should sound familiar by now. He wrote about what happens when a class of people he called the conditioners, the planners, the designers, the social engineers, decide that inherited human values and traditional institutions are merely the product of accident and superstition, and that they, armed with reason and modern methods, can do better, can design better arrangements, can determine from the outside what human life should look like. His conclusion: those conditioners don't gain power over nature. They lose their humanity. Because the values they're trying to replace are not accidents. They are the compressed result of everything the human race has learned about surviving, cooperating, and flourishing, passed down through customs, families, laws, and faiths that encode a wisdom no individual mind could have generated from scratch. Lewis didn't call it the knowledge problem. He didn't know Hayek's term. He was writing from literature and theology, not economics. But he was describing the same error. In 1943, C.S. Lewis and Friedrich Hayek, an Anglican Christian and an agnostic economist, writing from completely different disciplines for completely different audiences with no apparent coordination between them, converged on the same insight. The planner who believes he can rebuild society from first principles is not sophisticated. He is catastrophically ignorant of what the thing he's dismantling actually contains. 1 year later, in 1944, Hayek published The Road to Serfdom. And 44 years after that, at 89 years old, in what would be the last major work of his life, he named the error explicitly. He called it the fatal conceit. He traced it through human civilization, from primitive tribes to modern socialism, and he showed that it was not a modern invention. It was the oldest mistake in the history of governance. Here is what Hayek said in his Nobel lecture in 1974, 11 years before the fatal conceit was finished. He was speaking about the economists who believed they could manage economies the way engineers manage machines. The recognition of the insuperable limits to his knowledge ought indeed to teach the student of society a lesson in humility. Not caution, not modesty. Humility. The word chosen by a man who spent 50 years watching the most confident minds in the world produce the same wreckage, for the same reason, in country after country, century after century. The three words at the center of every policy failure in this video, every one of them, from Diocletian to the Federal Reserve, are these: we know better. Not malice, not incompetence, not corruption, though corruption follows in its wake. The belief, sincere and sometimes genuinely compassionate, that the right authority, with the right information and the right intentions, can manage what the market, the family, the tradition, and the community produce spontaneously through millions of accumulated decisions over centuries of living. That belief is the fatal conceit, and it has never, not once in 4,000 years of recorded history, produced what it promised. Here's what changes when you understand this. You stop asking, why did this policy fail? And start asking a prior question, did this policy assume knowledge that no authority can possess? Price caps on gasoline. Does the agency setting the price know what every producer, every distributor, every refiner, every consumer knows about the actual cost and value of that gasoline at this moment? No. Then the price cap will produce shortages. The mechanism is automatic. A federal agency mandating the production mix for the national energy grid. Does that agency hold the dispersed knowledge of engineers, local grid operators, weather forecasters, and fuel suppliers across the entire continent? No. Then the mandate will produce gaps. The mechanism is automatic. A university curriculum designed by a central committee to produce the right kind of graduates. Does that committee hold the knowledge of what skills, character traits, and values will actually serve those students across a lifetime of work and relationships that hasn't happened yet? No. Then the curriculum will produce something other than what was promised. The mechanism is automatic. Thomas Sowell, who spent his career as Hayek's American interpreter and is probably the sharpest translator of these ideas for a practical American audience, summarized the distinction this way: there are people who believe the world's problems result from a lack of sufficient control by the right authorities, and people who believe the world's problems result from granting too much control to any authority, no matter how well-intentioned. Hayek called the first group catastrophically mistaken. Not because they're evil, because they're wrong about what knowledge requires. You now have the framework. You can see the mechanism. And seeing the mechanism doesn't mean falling into despair. It means something more useful. It means you can read a new policy the way an engineer reads a blueprint. Not with tribal allegiance, with a question: does this require knowing what no one can know? That question is more clarifying than any editorial page you'll read this week. The video you just watched decoded one pattern. But Hayek didn't leave us with one warning. He spent 50 years documenting 12 distinct ways that the fatal conceit shows up in economic policy, in cultural institutions, in the erosion of faith and family, in the capture of universities, in the quiet replacement of evolved traditions with designed ones. Each warning is specific. Each one has a 2020 to 2026 example that you'll recognize the moment you see it. And each one comes with an argument you can make clearly and calmly, at the dinner table, in a conversation with a grandchild, in any room where someone is telling you the experts know best. That's what I put together in the Serfdom Decoder, Hayek's 12 warnings explained for today's America. 24 pages. Each warning in plain language, each one anchored to something that happened in the last 6 years. The link is in the description and in the pinned comment. The video is the sample. The guide is the 12. Hayek finished The Fatal Conceit at 89 years old. He had spent most of his career dismissed, marginalized, told by the dominant experts of his era that his ideas were the nostalgic remnants of a philosophy history had outgrown. He outlived almost all of them, and the ideas they declared finished turned out to be the only ones with enough explanatory power to account for what happened next. There's something worth sitting with in that. The man who understood better than anyone that no individual mind can hold enough knowledge to run a complex society. He spent his life doing the only thing any of us can actually do, contributing something true to a conversation that continues without us. Diocletian is gone. His edict is gone. The goods returned to the market the moment the controls were lifted, because the information was still there, held by millions of people he could never reach. That's the other side of the knowledge problem. The dispersed knowledge of a free society is not something that can be planned away. It can be suppressed, distorted, penalized. But it survives, because it lives in the decisions of ordinary people, farmers, bakers, families, communities, who hold their piece of the puzzle and act on it every day. You were never crazy for sensing that something was structurally wrong. You were reading the mechanism correctly without having its name. Now you have the name. The question that remains, and I'll leave it with you because it's worth sitting with, is this: if the mechanism is this clear, this old, this documented, why does the conceit keep finding believers? That answer is its own video. And it might be the most important one. Tell me the one thing you saw coming, clearly, years in advance, that nobody around you was willing to believe at the time.